That's very special for me, so thank you for eating and drinking worthily. I think Paul would be okay with the way that we do things. We're continuing to examine the I am statements, and again, what preachers like to do is to, we're going to have some kiddie activities today? K through 5. K through 5. All right. I only do that so that I can hear applause before I begin preaching.
It didn't sound very nice.
No, it didn't, did it? All right. So, preachers like sevens. You know, no, there are very few preachers that would say that they're into numerology, but we always do make a big deal out of the number 40 and the number 7 and the number 12 and, you know, some others in Scripture. So in John, there are 7 I am statements that are preached about. There are actually 8 statements where Jesus uses the term I am, similar to the term that was used in the burning bush episode as God identified himself. And there are also 7 signs or 7 miracles in the book of John that make a nice sermon, even though there are actually more miracles in John than 7. And so we're going to talk about one of the I am statements and the last of the public miracles of the 7 signs that are in the Gospel of John. It's the last miracle recorded by John in his gospel that was public. There's one other miracle in John near the end of the book, and that is the healing of the ear of Malchus that Peter, in his excitement and very poor swordsmanship, lopped off at the time of Jesus' arrest. So, It's kind of interesting how we like to bundle these things together for sermon's sake. But the I am statement that we're going to be talking about today is I am the resurrection and the life in verse 25 of chapter 11 of the Gospel of John. And to fully get the impact of the context of this statement, we need to move back and go to the beginning of the chapter. And if you want to think about the context of several chapters here, we have some healings and some miracles that Jesus did. And we had the Pharisees and Sadducees, the religious leaders of the day, who were being increasingly upset with Jesus and had plotted to kill him, and it just wasn't Jesus' time, and so they failed, but they continued to look for reasons to kill, to murder, to assassinate our Lord. We also have a time of great fruitfulness in the ministry. So as you look at chapter 10, verse 40, he departed again across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing earlier, and he remained there. Many came to him and said, John never did a sign, but everything John said about this man was true, and many believed in him. So Jesus was having a successful ministry where he was, and he had actually fled from Bethany. You know, there are 2 Bethanies not too very far apart. Has anybody ever heard of Pharisita?
Yeah.
There's about 6 of them in southern Colorado. Yes, there's a Pharisita in the valley. There's a Pharisita down towards Trinidad. There's a Pharisita. I had a package that I ordered with my address. They were looking for Pharisita, which was spelled Farcita. So anyway, this was true with Bethany. There were a couple of Bethanies in the region. And where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived, Jesus had escaped, and the disciples knew that they were having success where they were, and if they went back into the other region, they were subject to Jesus being assassinated. So that's a little bit of the background here. And when we talk about Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, another thing that can be confusing is there's lots of Marys in the Bible. Miriam was the mother of Moses, right? No? Yes? Sister. Anyway, was a significant character in the Old Testament. So there were a lot of people, and Mary is a form of Miriam. So there were lots of Marys. So we'll try to make sure that we get the right Mary here. Lazarus, this family was apparently fairly well known. They were friendly. It was a place where Jesus and some of his followers, his disciples, stayed in their home. And in the Jewish tradition, in fact, by Jewish law, particularly during traveling holiday seasons, it was not optional to let pilgrims, to stay in your house and feed them and be hospitable to them. And so Jesus often stayed with Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. Now, we're not used to that kind of family grouping remaining into adulthood. It's possible that the parents were gone early in life. We don't know. That's pure speculation, but their parents are never mentioned here, even with this sibling relationship. So with that background, let's read together 11:1. Now a man was sick, Lazarus from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And yes, this was the same Mary and Martha when Mary was paying attention to Jesus during a visit once, and Martha was busy cooking and cleaning and in the kitchen and whatever it is that they were doing in that particular environment. And she got kind of frustrated at her sister because her sister wasn't helping, was just being gaga over Jesus. And Martha came to Jesus and said, "Would you tell Martha to get in the kitchen and help me?" Now, have you ever been in a situation where somebody is talking to this party, but they're really trying to communicate an idea to this party, right? So I'm going to ask Jesus, are you listening, Mary? I'm going to ask Jesus to tell Mary to get moving, but that's the same group. Mary is the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. So you remember that account. Now that account chronologically does not occur in the Gospel of John until after chapter 11. So why would he refer to that? Well, John was probably the last gospel written, and the incident of anointing Jesus with expensive perfume and her hair was already well known from Matthew and Mark that had been written. So the writer here can refer to that episode knowing that the reader would probably have known that. So John knew that there were a lot of Marys, and so he wanted to say, oh, you remember that was the Mary that did this and that, right? And it was her brother Lazarus who was sick. So the sister sent a message to him, "Lord, the one you love is sick." Jesus heard it. Now, I want to make another note here. This is, we don't want to study too much because we want to focus on the I am statement, but friendship's a funny thing, particularly in church circles. Friendship is vital. Relationship is vital. Fellowship is vital. What can happen, though, are little circles that become closed and become cliques, and people have a hard time fitting in or being accepted into that circle. Even Jesus, right? He didn't take everybody up to the Mount of Transfiguration, right? And John, I just suspect to the other 11's aggravation, always referred to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. I always get a kick out of that. And so there were even groupings within the 12 that were Jesus' closest, and he had some that were more confidants and more friends. And there was jealousy there. Remember the argument, who's going to be vice Jesus in the coming kingdom? Can I sit on your right? Can I sit on your left? Even the parents got into it. Mom was going to, go to Jesus and ask for favors. And as I have expressed to you, and whether I'm right or wrong, Cheryl and I are careful about having like best friends from within the congregation. We had a couple at a church that we served who would ask us out to go out to eat with them after every Sunday service. And I don't have any problem with that, and some of you have done that because we had some things to talk about, or we end up at the coffee shop or whatever, and that's fine. But we sensed that, and these guys were like kind of upper middle class, and we knew that not everybody in the church could afford to make that offer, or would be willing to go spend $20 or $30 after church on Sunday. And so that would have been exclusive of other people. So we try to be careful. We love you all. We enjoy spending time with you. We do it in various ways. But and I didn't understand this until just recent years, there's a bubble that pastors kind of live in and it's, I know it's true in every profession, right? But we try to be good stewards of our relationships in that way, and I hope that you all appreciate that. And there are people in churches that just have to be best buds with the pastor. You've been in churches like that? Just got to be best buds with the pastor. And we've been privileged to be close friends with many of the pastors that we've had. But there's some care that has to be given there. And I suspect that they may be watching on YouTube. We just finished visiting with Pam and Alan, the legacy pastor from here, and he's a pastor down there bivocationally, and I'm bivocational up here. And so when we have the opportunity to have fellowship, being 5 hours apart, it's just kind of a different wavelength, and we really we can identify with some of the same things. So I just say that. So if there are times when you think that we are standoffish, I mean, you know that I'm cold-hearted, but you wouldn't expect that of my wife. And this whole thing about a pastor's wife and expectations to come along with that is a kind of a different cultural thing, and it varies from denomination to denomination and from area to area. And so I just, this was a special friend of Jesus. Lazarus was the friend that you love, your best friend, maybe. Can we allow Jesus to have a best friend? Can we allow Jesus to love somebody in a special way that maybe is different or more intense or special? Yeah, he was very much a human. When Jesus heard it, now this doesn't sound like a very friendly thing to say, "This sickness will not end in death, but is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God might be glorified through it." Now, we maybe have to kind of delve into issues of free will versus predestination or foreordination or foreknowledge. And I tend to be on the free will side and not on the, if you would say, Calvinist side. But there's plenty of scriptural validation all across the board. I'm not going to argue with you about it, right? So the question is, did God kill Lazarus? Well, I'm going to leave that hanging, but Jesus says, "This sickness will not end in death, but is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Now, Jesus was a storyteller. He was a parable teller. He was a metaphor user. He was brilliant in the use of language and communication. And so sometimes the disciples didn't really get what he was trying to say. So we see here in verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. That sentence doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't.
Lazarus is dying. Okay, well, let's hang out here for a couple of days. Then after that, he said to his disciples, let's go to Judea again. Jesus is letting the clock tick and the calendar pages turn, agonizingly so, for Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Rabbi, the disciples told him, just now the Jews tried to stone you. You're going to go there again? Aren't there 12 hours in a day? And here's an old saying that he's using. Jesus answered, if anyone walks during the day, he doesn't stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks during the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. Now, this sounds like it might have gone better with the last couple of sermons, but it's an old saying, which means you're alive now, so do what you can while you're alive. And embedded in that statement, I believe, is the idea that God knows what your last heartbeat is going to be, when your last breath is going to be taken, when your last moment in this earthly body is going to be. He knows when you're going to die. So listen carefully, and I'm not trying to engage in bravado here. I think this is a Christian truth. If somebody stands and confronts me with a firearm, I can confidently say, you have no power to kill me unless God gives you permission for that to happen.
Amen.
Now, I've been at the wrong end of a few different weapons. I've never made that statement out loud. But I really believe it wholeheartedly. Now, does that mean I'm not going to get a gut shot or something else? I just know as far as death goes, I will not die until God says it's time for you to die. So there's nothing that you can do to me that can take my life. And just like Jesus says, you're not taking my life, I'm giving it up.
Yeah.
So we can live pretty confidently that we are immune from premature death in God's timing. Now, does that mean we won't get sick or won't get a broken leg or won't have a traumatic brain injury or won't have some suffering? No, the issue is when you're going to die. So, if I say you don't have the power to kill me, you might have the power to wound me. I don't know. But that's what Jesus was saying. I'll go back to where all those assassins are because it's not my time. And I'm absolutely confident in that. You can live in that same confidence about death. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm on my way to wake him up. You see the reluctance of the disciples? They don't want to go back there because it's dangerous. They don't have the faith that Jesus has. And they don't want to believe that Jesus is talking in a metaphor. I mean, they do want to believe that Jesus is talking in a metaphor because they don't want to hear that Lazarus is dying. So this is how they interpret it. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm on my way to wake him up. And Jesus is obviously talking about death. Then the disciples said, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he'll get well.
They really didn't believe it.
They didn't quite get it. Jesus, however, was speaking about his death, but they thought he was speaking about the natural sleep. So Jesus then told them plainly, Lazarus has died. I'm glad for you that I wasn't there so that you may believe, but let's go to him. This is, if we kind of casually, oh yeah, there's that miracle where Lazarus came out of the grave. But this is some, wow, this is some heavy theology. This is some heavy understanding about God. And the God's purpose in all things is that he himself might be glorified. God has a very justified and insatiable, unending desire to be glorified. Now, any other entity on the planet, from humans down and up, that had that kind of ego, we would condemn as having some real mental sociology problems. But God is absolutely deserving. And so it should be our focus to glorify God in our work, in our worship, in our daily lives, in our relationships, to glorify God. Number one priority. That's God's priority, God's purpose. That's our purpose. It was Christ's purpose, and it was going to be manifested in this miracle. Now, Jesus is recorded as having brought to life a couple of other people in the Gospel of John. They're Jairus' daughter, remember that, and then the widow's son. It was actually in the middle of the funeral procession. But these were deaths that happened kind of, that Jesus was on the scene pretty soon after the death, so that it could be, oh yeah, well they were just resuscitated or something like that. And something I learned in reviewing this account is that the Jews, they don't embalm like the Egyptians and the Romans. You get buried right away. However, they also believe that the person's spirit remained for 3 days around the body. So it is no accident that Lazarus had been in the grave for 4 days. No doubt that it was a resurrection and not merely a resuscitation. Then Thomas called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let's go too, so that we may die with him." Now, we all talk about doubting Thomas. I like Thomas a lot. If he'd spent all that time with those other 11 knuckleheads, he wouldn't believe that Jesus rose from their testimony either. And then here he has this very brave, kind of pessimistic, but very brave statement. I'll go with you, I'll die with you. Peter would have said something like that. In fact, he did say something like that, and then he went and hid. And so I don't know the man. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days, significant. Bethany was near Jerusalem, less than 2 miles away. Many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them about their brother. Now, in this period of time, just a little cultural reminder of the funeral rites. You had somebody said at my dad's funeral, a man spends his whole life gathering a crowd for his funeral. I thought that was kind of interesting. And Dad died young enough that he hadn't outlived his friends, and it was, I just remember being in the funeral procession and looking at that long string of cars, and he was, he was not a famous man, he was just an ordinary guy, but he was well loved, and so was Lazarus. So there was a lot of people at the funeral. And, as you probably have heard, if you think about our traditional funeral, which is, they're kind of going away, but the traditional funeral is a big casket, and people agonize. I remember when my mom and I were going to pick out a casket for Dad, and she I don't want to buy something cheap. I said, Dad, he wouldn't want, So that's a hard decision because there's some guilt involved, and I don't want to, you can get them online from Walmart. And then flowers are a way to express your condolences, and we bring food sometimes to the people in the grieving. Well, they might have done all that, but one of the things they did do is hire professional mourners, and they would hire some weepers and wailers for some period of days. So, and I don't know what the purpose of that was, maybe to give relief to people who they were just out of tears. Grief is so exhausting, so we'll just hire somebody to express our grief for us. But there were lots of people, there was lots of noise, there was lots of activities. And you know how, and I hope this is true in if anybody has a memorial service for me, that people get together after and they talk about, old times and tell stories and laugh. I love hearing laughter after a funeral.
Yes.
Right? That sounds odd, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
And so there were all kinds of things going on here, but everybody was very confident that Lazarus was dead. As soon as Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary remained seated in the house. That's kind of the Martha Mary personality showing through here, isn't it? Then Martha said to Jesus, now Martha already has a history of telling Jesus what her expectations are for how he should live. Right? He would fit in Walsenburg so well. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Martha, Martha, Martha. So Martha, I love psychoanalyzing her. She gives this affirmation that Jesus has this healing, miraculous power and could have saved Lazarus if he had done so in the way that Martha outlined for saving people. So she expresses faith and annoyance and disappointment at the same time. Your brother will rise again, Jesus told her. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at that last day. Now, I gave an inflection to that phrase that I'm imposing on Martha. So I think we usually read that, I know that he'll rise again on the resurrection last day. But I kind of read it like, I know that he'll rise again on the resurrection on the last day. I get your theology, I know. That's no comfort to me. He's still dead. But Jesus said to her, here's the I am statement. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection of the life. I'm not the ruler. I'm not the manager. I'm not the promiser. I'm not the symbol. I'm not the embodiment. I'm not merely the example. I am the resurrection and the life. So those of us who have accepted the lordship of Christ over our lives have a Jesus who is our resurrection and life. Which means that not only will we not die until God says it's time for us to die, but we will be in the Lord's presence and have at the appropriate time a resurrected body, which I presume is going to be very much like the body that Jesus had when he rose from the grave. You guys can argue about that too. So the one who believes in me, even if he dies, will live. Now, folks, there are so many permutations of religious belief, thousands of gods, thousands of ways to understand or misunderstand Christianity. But Christianity is absolutely unique in the lesson that we learned from Lazarus. What other religion says there is a specific God-glorifying purpose in the tragic, agonizing death of another person? So what other religions will say, well, that's karma. That's the choices that you made. Blaming the victim. It doesn't matter. You're just like dogs. If you die on the side of the road, you just rot like any other animal. You know no better, no worse. But God gives purpose not just to life, but gives purpose to death. Now, I would like to die at an old age. And some of you say, well, you're already there. But I want to die well. And I may not. I may just be a mess. I may have lost my mind. I may be a burden. I may be in pain. I may not be as gracious as I would like to be. I don't know. It's hard, but I hope that I die well. Hope that I die well. But I'm not going to die until God says it's time.
Amen.
I am the resurrection and the life. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? We don't get recycled into another life. We don't go to some whatever. We don't go to some level. We live in another plane with the Lord. Yes, Lord, I believe you're Messiah, the Son of God, who comes into the world. And yet, when Jesus calls out to Lazarus, what's the warning that he gets? It's going to stink.
Yeah.
Now, I've investigated many deaths. Been a death investigator for coroner's office for 5 years. So I could tell you about what happens to bodies after they die.
Yeah.
It's not pretty. We were not destined to have any use to our bodies unless you're an organ donor after our spirit leaves, right? But she's absolutely right. And this was a day you don't go off to the hospital to die. You don't go off to the nursing home to die. You don't get picked up by the funeral home people within a couple of hours. You don't get embalmed. They lived in a rural environment where death and the stench of death was an ordinary occurrence. So it was not offensive or scary or anything. They just, as a matter of fact, he'd been in the grave for 4 days. He's going to stink. And anyway, long story short, Jesus said, remove the stone. And he prayed. So this was a very, very clear miracle, a very, very public miracle, a very, very pointed miracle saying Jesus has power over life and death. And it provoked the anger of the religious elite who saw that not as a sign that he was indeed the Son of God, but saw it as a sign that they were about to lose their power and influence because this guy really had something. And they rejected him. The proof of the resurrection of Lazarus, and they tried to kill Lazarus later, right? The proof of the resurrection of Lazarus is as convincing as the proof of the resurrection of Jesus. Historically, witnesses, all those kinds of things. That, along with the panoply of the universe that we can see, we were outside with our friends the other night. We're usually inside when the beautiful stars are out there, but we stayed up to watch them, along with the Starlink satellite string. Have you seen that?
Yes.
That's neat.
That is really spooky. We've got Starlink, so I'm glad they're up there. But if you can look at that majesty and say, well, there's no God, or if you can look at the truths of this scripture. Have you gotten to read much of that book?
I haven't looked at it yet.
Very, very, if you get a chance to read that Is Atheism Dead book by Greg Metaxas. Let me tell you, there's no excuse for rejecting Christ. There is no excuse for rejecting Christ. He makes himself known. He wants to make himself known. He does not wish that any be lost. He wants you to be saved. He wants you to be in eternity with him. I've betrayed my self-imposed 20-minute limit, but this is such an important and vital account that we need to digest and then to live day by day knowing that our Lord is the resurrection and the life, and because I believed in him, I will never die. You're looking at a man whose body will be corrupt and fade and go away, but you're also looking at someone who is immortal. The heart of who I am and who God made me to be will never die. I'm looking out on a group of people who will never die. I'm looking at immortality. I'm looking at eternity. I'm looking at people who have entrusted their lives in the one who is the resurrection and the life. Are we living that way? Well, let's think about that.